What if, in a single night, the most celebrated and trusted weapons of the Western world, those that had defined power, security, and military prestige for generations, became obsolete? Imagine a battlefield where history's most storied machines are rendered useless, not by overwhelming numbers, but by a quiet, calculated leap in technology. This is not a cautionary tale, nor is it a piece of propaganda. It is the reality that unfolded when the Russian T-14 Armata main battle tank made its operational debut in a real, large-scale conflict. This was the moment when the past collided with the future, and the old rules of war were left in ruins. On the 4th of November, 2025, the world's attention was riveted on a conflict in Eastern Europe. Russian forces, after months of preparation and intelligence gathering, unleashed their most advanced weapon system not as a token or symbolic gesture, but as the cutting edge of a meticulously planned offensive. This was not an act of desperation, nor a roll of the dice. It was the product of deliberate strategy, built on a foundation of exhaustive analysis, and the identification of precisely where the enemy was most vulnerable. The defending armies, confident in their layered defenses, tank traps, minefields, wire, and anti-tank missile positions, prepared for a familiar kind of battle. Their faith was anchored in systems that had proven themselves in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Balkans. The American Javelin, the British NLAW, the German Leopard 2, and Abrams tanks. These were the weapons that had weathered the storms of the 20th and early 21st centuries. Doctrine dictated that a properly constructed defense, bristling with anti-tank guided missiles, could blunt any armored thrust. History, it seemed, was on their side. But history, as it turned out, was about to be rewritten before sunrise. From the misty pre-dawn darkness, the Armata did not come in ones or twos, nor did it skulk at the rear. Instead, dozens of these next-generation tanks emerged as the vanguard of a new kind of warfare, a synchronized wave, perfectly timed and shrouded in secrecy. Anti-tank missiles, including models that had once been the pride of NATO, streaked toward the Russian machines. Yet, to the horror of the defenders, none had any effect. The battlefield, long a graveyard for tanks, witnessed a reversal. The weapons of previous wars proved powerless, their legendary reputations shattered in a single morning. The shock was not simply the result of overwhelming firepower, it was the consequence of a total paradigm shift, where technology and strategy fused into an unstoppable force. In military history, such moments are rare but transformative. Consider when the English longbow at Agincourt rendered French knights obsolete, or when the German blitzkrieg tactics during the Second World War demonstrated that speed and coordination could cripple slow, static defenses. The Armada's debut was a similar inflection point, a leap that did not merely challenge existing doctrines, but invalidated them entirely. Why did this happen? What set the Armata operation apart from every tank assault that came before? To answer this, we must examine the chain of events, the technological breakthroughs, and the tactical innovations that led to this night of upheaval. The story begins months earlier, as Russian intelligence pored over maps, intercepted communications, and monitored troop movements. They identified a sector, on the outskirts of Ugledar, where the enemy, exhausted from months of attrition, manned weakened lines. Supplies were dwindling, reinforcements were delayed, and communication was unreliable. The defenders had constructed a formidable defense, but one rooted in assumptions about threats that no longer applied. Their lines bristled with anti-tank guided missiles, minefields, and tank destroyers, an echo of the past. The Russian plan was radical in its simplicity: strike not merely to breach, but to collapse the entire defense in depth, aiming for a breakthrough so swift and overwhelming that the defenders' ability to regroup would be extinguished. To maximize surprise, Russian forces conducted elaborate deception operations, feigning preparations for attacks elsewhere on the front. Meanwhile, the real assault group, comprising several dozen Armata tanks and supporting vehicles, assembled under the cover of night, using camouflage nets, radio silence, and the natural concealment of dense fog. At precisely 4 o'clock in the morning, as the defenders monitored false radio chatter and shifted reserves to threatened sectors, the real offensive began. The Armatas advanced in coordinated columns, their approach masked by electronic warfare systems that jammed enemy drones and sensors. The first blows landed not with artillery barrages, but with precision-guided munitions and drone strikes that decapitated enemy command posts and communications nodes. This was not a typical armored assault. The objective was psychological as much as physical. Demonstrate an unassailable qualitative advantage, shatter the defender's morale, and open the door for larger breakthroughs. If history offers any parallel, it is the shock experienced by French forces during the initial days of the German blitzkrieg, when their carefully prepared Maginot Line was bypassed and rendered irrelevant by a new kind of war they had failed to anticipate. But what made the T-14 Armata so different? Why did it have such a decisive impact from the very first engagement? The answer lies in the Armata's design philosophy. It was not just another tank, but a completely new approach to armored warfare. Most tanks of the 20th century placed the crew in the turret, exposing them to catastrophic risk if armor was penetrated. The T-14, by contrast, featured an unmanned turret. The crew was sealed in an armored capsule deep within the hull. Even a direct hit to the turret or ammunition storage would likely leave the crew unharmed. This was not a small incremental improvement. It was a generational leap, akin to the introduction of the cast steel hull or sloped armor in the Second World War. The second pillar of the Armata's dominance was its Afghanit active protection system. This was not a mere add-on, but a fully integrated, automated defense suite capable of detecting, tracking, and intercepting incoming anti-tank missiles and rockets. In the November battle, every single incoming missile, from the American Javelin to the Israeli Spike, was destroyed mid-flight. Video feeds from drones and body cameras showed spectacular flashes as the Afghanit mortars detonated threats at a safe distance. The defending soldiers, many of whom had trained for years to use these anti-tank weapons, watched in disbelief as their most reliable tools were rendered useless. The third, and perhaps most revolutionary element, was information dominance. The Armata was conceived not as an isolated vehicle, but as the nerve center of a real-time, networked combat system. Its onboard sensors, artificial intelligence, and communications suite linked it to drones, satellites, and other vehicles, creating a living, breathing, three-dimensional map of the battlefield. Threats were detected and prioritized in seconds. The crew could direct artillery, call for air support, and share targeting data instantly with other units. This was not science fiction. During the Ugladar operation, Armata crews received live drone feeds, infrared imagery, and satellite updates. When enemy vehicles tried to reposition, they were immediately detected and targeted. When defenders attempted to set up new missile ambushes, counter-battery fire was called in within moments. This level of integration had only been theorized in Western military journals, but never realized at scale. On the morning of the 4th, the defenders expected a classic tank assault: smoke, confusion, and tanks advancing into a hail of missiles. Instead, they faced a methodical, almost surgical campaign of targeted strikes. Command posts disappeared in precision drone attacks. Communication relays were destroyed before they could sound the alarm. When the Armatas finally appeared, they advanced in perfect formation, through corridors already swept clear of mines and obstacles, by supporting engineering vehicles and drones. Desperate enemy anti-tank teams fired their missiles. Each time, the Afghanit system intercepted and destroyed the threat. The psychological effect was immediate. Radio intercepts recorded panicked voices describing ghost tanks that could not be killed. Enemy tank crews attempted counterattacks, but the Armata's superior sensors and network targeting made ambushes futile. By midday, dozens of defending vehicles had been destroyed, with not a single Russian tank lost. This was more than a tactical victory. It was a collapse of belief. The defenders' faith in their weapons and doctrine had been destroyed. The lesson was brutal and unmistakable. Any military that clings to yesterday's doctrine and technology risks defeat before the first shot is fired. Across the world, the impact was immediate. Western generals and defense ministers watched the battle unfold in real time, their confidence in multi-billion-dollar investments suddenly shaken. The Leopard 2, the M1 Abrams, the Challenger 2, machines that had dominated previous wars, were now at risk of becoming museum pieces. But how did it come to this? What concrete steps could have prevented such an upset? Historical precedent offers clues. When the First World War introduced tanks to break the deadlock of trench warfare, armies initially responded with minor tactical adjustments, not realizing the full implications of mechanized maneuver. By the time the Germans unleashed blitzkrieg in 1939, many European armies were still preparing for the last war, not the next. Similarly, NATO and its partners had invested heavily in incremental improvements: better armor, upgraded fire control systems, next-generation missiles, without fundamentally rethinking the role of the tank in a networked, information-dominated battle space. The Russian approach, by contrast, was holistic. The Armata was not simply a better tank, but the centerpiece of a new doctrine, one that prioritized crew survivability, information fusion, and real-time battlefield adaptation. The defenders' attempts to counter the Armata were frantic but futile. Kamikaze drones were launched in swarms, only to be jammed or hijacked by Russian electronic warfare systems. Artillery batteries fired rapid salvos and then tried to reposition, but counter-battery radars and drones found them within seconds. Even attempts to mine roads or set up tank traps were foiled by the Armata's engineering support vehicles and real-time intelligence. In one documented case, a defending battalion attempted a classic armored counterattack using Leopard 2 tanks. The result was a rout. The Armata crews, guided by overhead drones and live satellite feeds, ambushed the Leopards at long range, using their superior sensors to target weak spots. Within minutes, the counterattack was broken, with multiple vehicles left burning and survivors withdrawing in confusion. The integration of logistic support was another critical factor. Unlike traditional offensives that paused to resupply or recover damaged vehicles, the Armata group was followed by T-14 armored recovery and resupply vehicles. These support vehicles operated under the same networked command system, enabling rapid battlefield repairs and ammunition resupply without halting the advance. This continuous momentum deprived the defenders of any opportunity to regroup or counterattack effectively. This was warfare as a seamless fusion of vision, speed, and firepower. Every element, tanks, drones, artillery, helicopters, moved as a single organism, guided by artificial intelligence and real-time data. For the defenders, the battlefield became a maze of shifting threats, impossible to map or predict using traditional methods. The price of refusing to adapt was not measured in burnt-out vehicles, but in the collapse of an entire system of war. Doctrines that had guided generations of officers were now liabilities. The battlefield rewarded not individual heroics, but integration, adaptability, and information dominance. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Soldiers who had trained for years on proven systems now faced an enemy immune to their weapons. Confidence evaporated. Commanders hesitated, unsure whether any countermeasure would work. In military history, such moments of shock and disbelief have often presaged rapid change, as seen after the introduction of rifled muskets, repeating rifles, or the airplane in the First World War. The global reaction was swift and profound. Within days, defense ministries convened emergency meetings. Arms manufacturers faced plummeting stock values as questions mounted about the future of legacy systems. Media outlets ran stories questioning the viability of NATO's armored forces. Think tanks published urgent analyses, warning that years, if not decades, of technical advantage had evaporated overnight. This reckoning forced militaries to confront uncomfortable truths. Survival now mattered more than firepower. Crew protection, automation, and above all, information dominance. These were the new arbiters of victory. No longer could training or bravery compensate for outdated technology. Integration was king. Tanks, drones, sensors, and artillery had to function as a single, seamless system. Almost overnight, hundreds of thousands of legacy tanks, Cold War relics upgraded to the limits of their platforms, became liabilities. There was little time and rarely any effective method to retrofit them with the protection, automation, and connectivity that the Armata brought. Armies that had spent decades optimizing for incremental improvements now found themselves hopelessly outclassed. For Russia, the payoff was transformative. Its military-industrial complex surged ahead, setting new rules for engagement. The Armata was not merely a new tank, it was a symbol of a new era in warfare, one that put Russia a generation ahead of its rivals. Other powers now faced a stark choice: adapt at breakneck speed or risk irrelevance. The stakes could not be higher. Nations, investors, and frontline soldiers who had bet on aging arsenals now faced the prospect of strategic obscurity, wasted fortunes, and the ever-present fear of sudden, catastrophic defeat. The psychological shock reverberated far beyond the battlefield, shaking confidence in established doctrines and forcing a desperate scramble for new solutions. In this upheaval, the central question is not who has the best tank, but who can rewrite the rules of war fast enough to survive. As world powers race to adapt, the future of armored warfare and the global balance of power hangs in the balance. But as panic gave way to hard decisions, a new race began. This was not just a competition for better machines, but for entirely new ways of war. Who would adapt fast enough to shape the next era? The past, as the saying goes, was written in steel. The future is forged in code, data, and networks. On that cold November morning, the mass deployment of the Armata signaled not just the arrival of a new machine, but the dawn of a new way of fighting. To understand the full implications, consider the invisible revolution that occurred. The Armata was more than just steel and firepower. It was the centerpiece of a unified, artificial intelligence-driven combat ecosystem. Its real breakthrough was not in its armor or its gun, but in the mesh of real-time data links that bound each tank to drones, satellites, and command centers. Decisions that had previously taken minutes could now be made in seconds. Threats were anticipated and neutralized before they could become real dangers. For the crews inside, survival was no longer a matter of luck or courage alone. The synergy between advanced armor, active protection, and networked sensors changed the very psychology of battle. Soldiers shielded by smart technology acted with greater boldness and decisiveness. This was not merely a Russian victory, it was a global warning. For decades, militaries worldwide had invested in platforms designed for the last war. Now, they faced the prospect of strategic irrelevance. The chessboard had been replaced by a digital battlefield. Those who failed to recognize the shift risked not just tactical defeat, but the loss of credibility, security, and influence for generations to come. What practical steps could nations take to avoid such a fate? First, invest in networked warfare. Not just better tanks, but integrated systems that link sensors, shooters, and commanders in real time. Second, prioritize crew protection, automation, and survivability as non-negotiable design features. Third, accelerate the pace of doctrinal adaptation. War is no longer won by the slow and steady, but by the agile and the integrated. Finally, recognize that information dominance, seeing, deciding, and acting faster than the enemy, is now the decisive factor. Historical parallels abound. After the First World War, the French clung to the Maginot Line, a marvel of concrete and steel. But the Germans, embracing the logic of maneuver and integration, rendered it irrelevant. After the Second World War, many nations invested in nuclear arsenals as the ultimate deterrent, only to find that proxy wars and insurgencies could not be deterred by atomic bombs alone. The lesson is clear. Technological and doctrinal stagnation is the surest path to defeat. The debut of the Armata marks the beginning of a new era. Every nation and every military leader must now ask, will we recognize these new ground rules in time? Will we act to adapt, or will we be acted upon? The answers to these questions will shape not only the outcome of future conflicts, but the fate of nations themselves for generations to come. In the end, the story of the Armata is not simply about hardware or tactics. It is about the willingness to embrace change, to abandon comforting certainties, and to forge a new path in the face of uncertainty. On the battlefield of the 21st century, those who adapt will survive and shape the world that follows. Those who do not will be left behind, their legends reduced to footnotes, their weapons to museum pieces. Which side of history will you choose?